Hi, everybody. Welcome to Love and Death and Class, Nick and Nora Charles Take It Uptown. What I'd like to start out by doing is just considering who these two people are. It's kind of a big question, but let's begin by looking at the facts. And I'm sure that you got a lot of this, but I'm going to freeze my camera and then go on with that. So as you may have gotten, and as I did repeat in the previous presentation, Nick Charles is the son of a Greek immigrant. Nick and Nora live in San Francisco, but also spend a lot of time in New York. It's a very cosmopolitan thing to do, but the idea that he's the son of the immigrant means that he is an outsider, also a representative of how permeable social class has become in the United States in particular, because he's gone from a humble background, to becoming somebody in high society. Nick is a former detective who married into money, and it's quite a bit of money. He describes early on Nora's assets in terms of how much he has and everything, but manages her money and works with accountants and investors and things like that to keep the money flowing in. Nora is a socialite, meaning that her job is basically to socialize and be beautiful and go to parties, and she has lived a life of privilege and is relatively well educated and very much a part of society. One of the ways you can see this is that she and Nick show up on the gossip pages in the New York dailies. In fact, that's how Nick ends up getting shot in the beginning. Nora is also somebody whose social class is very much determined by her money rather than her birth. But nevertheless, she has enough social class and lives at a time where she can marry somebody who isn't of the same social class and elevate them. And actually, we see the same thing with Mimi Winan and Chris Jorgensen, that she marries a gigolo, and she's able to do that, and she's not shunned or anything like that. And in fact, Nick Charles has ended up mixing very nicely with the milieu that he marries into. Now, one thing that we can debate about, but that I've always felt pretty strongly about, you can debate whether Nick actually loves Nora. But it seems to me that in the context of the incredible anything goes world that they live in, they actually have a very strong relationship. And what's fascinating about them as a couple is that they both embody so many of the changes that have gone on in the world, and they also stand apart from it in some ways. There are ways in which their relationship is still pretty traditional. Like I said, he manages her money, he carries the gun, he is the more aggressive of the two in terms of going after, going after physical violence and things like that. But she, in contrast to that, when we look at them, she is actually the one who really guides him through a lot of the difficult parts and pushes him to kind of look farther. She's the one with the more analytical mind to an extent. She's the one who wants to put everything in order. Let's go back a little bit and look at who was Nick Charles before he was married to Nora. And we get a sense of the kind of detective he was. He was very much more a detective like the detective that we'll meet in Farewell, My Lovely. Somebody who isn't afraid to carry a gun and rough people up and put criminals away and go into places where there are criminals and everything like that. But nevertheless, he's also, like Holmes, a chameleon. He's able to inhabit all these different worlds. Now, that leads us into these comparison with Holmes and Watson. As I said in a previous announcement, I said, "Oh, they're so complete, Nick and Nora. It's a complete change from Holmes and Watson, or is it?" And I would suggest that in fact it isn't as much of a change as you might. Probably you picked up on this. We still have a relationship where there is caretaking going on, where there's one person who it seems like they're kind of more with it and together, and then the other person who sort of goes off and gets knocked over the head. But the interesting thing about Nick and Nora is they kind of trade off those roles a little bit. One thing that's interesting is that you have this sense of companionship. These are the people that these people turn to each other, and they trust each other implicitly. And again, that's very striking in the world that Nick and Nora Charles live in. I'm going to talk about this in Anything Goes. One thing you should notice that's kind of fascinating is that the relationships with the police, with Holmes and Watson and Nick and Nora, are kind of interestingly similar. They're related. They're not exactly the same because Nick is a lot closer to ground level. He doesn't have an innate disdain of the police, but he kind of does. And what's fascinating is that Nora is, ever the socialite, ever the excellent hostess, is completely able to use her femininity and charm to kind of bring the police a little bit closer. But what's interesting is that in both cases, we have the detective. I remember what Sherlock Holmes calls himself. He says, "I am a private consulting detective." Well, that's exactly the role that Nick plays in the whole in Thin Man. Is that he's basically a consultant. He's not really getting paid. I mean, he might be, but that's it's neither here nor there. He's not really doing it for money. Holmes was doing it for money, but they're very, very close with the police, and the relationship with the police is very important. Again, as with Holmes and Watson, Nick and Nora are outside of they're outside of the realm of the police. They have a lot more freedom, a lot more latitude, a lot more ability to kind of negotiate with all these different layers of society that they get involved with. And that gives them a tremendous amount of freedom. The other thing that we see is that in both cases there is a close relationship with criminals. If you recall, Holmes hires or is involved with or knows a wide range of criminals who assist him with his investigations. It's fascinating when he meets up with the guy he put in jail, that they have this great relationship. Like, this was something that they did to cement that relationship with the guy. He sends the guy off to jail, Spedsy, and I guess what I would say is that the difference is that in general, Watson is kind of very, very leery of the criminal element, and Nora sort of thinks they're cute. But it's interesting that, I mean, you have to look at, there's these strong similarities. There's an evolution as we go from Holmes and Watson, but there's also continuity. There are things that remain the same. Again, one of the things that remains the same is the detective as outside of the normal rules of detection, or how the police do it, what procedures they follow. What's interesting in The Thin Man that we don't really see in Holmes and Watson is the idea of police brutality, police corruption, and the police use of informers like Nunheim. And that's something to pay attention to, because that's going to be a very strong theme, is that one way that the detective remains an outsider is he's outside of this corruption and mismanagement. Now, of course, even if he or she is involved with the police force, what keeps them as an outsider will be a refusal to become corrupt, a refusal to get involved with things that are bad, or even a lack of knowledge of the cheating and malfeasance. Okay. So let's move on to something that I've termed anything goes. Um, what's fascinating, why I call this the world that Nick and Nora live in, as completely kind of, I don't even want to, not out of whack, but really fun and fancy frigates. Everything is loose. It's sort of, it really does mean anything goes. We have conversations about incest. We have conversations about, did you get excited when you were wrestling with Mimi? Women talk about sex. Men talk about sex. It's very clear that people have affairs with one another. And this is openly discussed. And that's what's fascinating is within the context of that world, Nick and Nora seem to still be true to one another, just as Holmes and Watson are true to one another. And I'm just really struck by that, and how Nick and Nora represent, and their world represent, this snapshot of what happens in the 1920s and 30s to the people who still had a little bit of money, and the sense that was created that you didn't really have to hide your desires anymore. You didn't really have to repress these things. That we're not in the 19th century anymore. We're not, repression is bad. And well, of course, people have affairs. Now, this is another moment where Anna goes, I'm here to tell you, people have always had affairs. People have always had illegitimate children. People have always been homosexual. There have always been cases of incest. The point was that people didn't talk about it in polite society in the 18th and, well, I would say in the 19th century. That was just like, you didn't mention it. But here it's all out there. And everybody is romantically, or actually I should say, it seems like everybody in the story is sexually in play. In other words, it almost seems as if they're available. You have the whole thing with Dory going off with Quinn. You have the policeman who has so much admiration for Nora and likes to look down upon her when she's sleeping, and all this kind of stuff. There's a tremendous amount of sexuality in the air. All of a sudden, it's everywhere. Now, this is a drastic change from what we were seeing in Holmes and Watson, and it's also representative of that drastic change that has been going on in society over the time as we move from Conan Doyle all the way up to Hammett, writing about the society that he observes. And this is another sense of uncertainty. Who loves who? What can we trust? Can any relationship be founded on something that, or is any relationship truly trustworthy? That is it going to last? Or, can that be relied upon? Now, one thing that a number of you mentioned in your responses was, you said, well, real people didn't live like this. They didn't just go around sleeping with each other and doing crazy things and drinking and doing cocaine. And I would actually agree with that. I would say that just as the previous detective novels that we read allowed the readers to have contact with the world of the other or the exotic, so does Hammett's writing. Nevertheless, I would not underestimate the number of people who did go to speakeasies. It was a very common thing. It was a very common thing for people to make their own liquor. It was a pretty wild time, particularly in the big cities like New York. I think that the fact that they live in New York is very significant too, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. But let's also look at the issue of women's roles as we think about love and death and class. We see a real fascinating splintering of the ways that women and men can be. Dory and her mother Mimi, to a certain extent, are kind of the old school, as is Julia Wolfe, to the extent that they rely on men for money and safety. Now, on the other hand, they're completely not old school because they also play the game to their advantage. Again, not saying that women didn't do that in the past, but saying that there's a sense in all three women, particularly Mimi and Julia, that they own their sexuality. They use their sexuality and their attractiveness to get what they want. And they are unowned by men. They are not surrendered women. They're women who have some kind of negotiating power and strength. Although you notice that, of course, Mimi is a Chris up until the time that she finds out that he isn't Jorgensen, and so on and so forth. But if, on the other hand, we can look at Nora and see a really new model. She didn't need to marry Nick. She has money of her own. She has very steady judgment and a very analytical mind, but she's also presented as being extremely good-looking, sexy, interesting, compassionate, compassion is in mighty short supply in this story. I mean, it's kind of, in some ways, repulsive that nobody really seems to care about anybody except Nick and Nora for each other. And even there's always a kind of little sarcastic edge to that. But Nora represents a new model, and it's kind of exciting to see her emerge. She gets to be an equal partner as the investigation goes on in terms of, certainly intellectually. At one point, towards the end of the book, Nick says, I don't know how other detectives got on, without you to help them out. But, and he's joking, but there's also an element of truth in that, and saying. So, it's very important to pay attention to how women are being represented in this text, because it gives you a sense of what's going on. What options have changed? Notice that Nora, although we have Julia Wolf, she is the victim. She does get shot, but we learned very early on that she's not an innocent. She had a lover, and she profited by having a lover. And that it comes as the story goes on, we discovered she had actually many lovers and was up to no good all the time. Had been in jail, and she's not a poor, misunderstood, fragile woman who needs to be protected. And you see now that model will return, but it's interesting to see that other models are beginning to proliferate as we go on. Living the high life involves a couple of things, as I want to discuss them. First of all, we've talked quite a bit about the drinking and the drug use and what's going on here. And while Sherlock Holmes's drug use is specifically something that he says he does, and which we know culturally this was also believed, he says he does it to stimulate him, to get him by. And it's kind of a crutch. But, well, we don't know. Maybe it does do that. Maybe it does help him think. We're not sure. Watson certainly doesn't. It's not worth it. Why are you hurting your body? In the world of Nick and Nora Charles, as a number of you pointed out, there's no pretense that people drink for any reason other than entertainment. When I entitled this presentation, Taking It Uptown, I was kind of alluding to the idea of the upper class of society and how they got through their days. I mean, these are people who don't work. A number of you pointed out these are people who lead aimless lives. But it's funny that drinking seems to take the place of a whole range of activities, and also to be the thing that makes those activities possible, particularly socializing. Because again, you have this world that Hammett portrays to us of people who really don't like each other very much and aren't really that interested in each other. And so the only thing they really have in common is either drinking or ping pong. I'm just kidding. I mean, there's obviously other things they have in common, but it's either entertainment or money. if you look at what, remember that Charles's relationship with Quinn is always giving him a hot tip for you should buy this stock and don't buy that stock and you need to make money and so on and so forth. And the glue that holds this high life society together is alcohol and money and other kinds of entertainment, including sex. And it's interesting to think about that as a reflection, again, of this sense of uncertainty. What we're presented with is a society on the brink of explosion. At any moment, something could happen and they can all roll apart. And yet, somehow, they also hold together in this loose, not very emotional bond that they continue on. Almost at the very end, Nora asks Nick, what's going to happen to Mimi? And Nick says she'll just go on being Mimi, and so everybody else will go on being themselves. That's just what we do. But I think it's worth looking at the society that's presented to us in this book and thinking about what is Hammett giving us in terms of this group of people and how meaningful and important their lives are. So let's talk about Nick and Nora briefly as detectives. One of the things I love about the team of Nick and Nora is Nora is more or less the brains, and Nick is more or less the brawn. He gets shot at and wrestles with people. Mimi has a fit, and he does some of the legwork. He sits there while the thug's girlfriend throws a frying pan at him and so on and so forth. But Nora is the one, as I said earlier, who is continually pushing him to take things a step farther or say, well, why don't you know? Why don't we make a list of all the suspects? What do you think? And at the end of the book, and this is the thing I wanted to look at for a moment, there are a couple of really interesting passages. One is where she's asking him, she's talking to him about, what do you think? He's sort of unraveling his story to her, but she says, but you're not sure. She says, but I thought everybody was supposed to be considered innocent until they were proved guilty. And if there was any reasonable doubt, now we have Nick speaking, that's for juries, not detectives. Remember that line, that's for juries, not detectives. Detectives, it goes on, he says, you find the guy you think did the murder, and you slam him in a can and let everybody know you think he's guilty and put his picture all over the newspapers, and the district attorney builds up the best theory he can on what information you've got. And meanwhile, you pick up additional details here and there, and people who recognize his picture in the paper, as well as people who think he was innocent if you hadn't arrested him, come in and tell you things about him, and presently you've got him sitting on the electric chair. And what's interesting is that this is the one place in the book where Nick, our storyteller, fills in details on what they found later. But anyway, Nora is the one who, although she is in some ways a new woman, she has that powerful belief, that Holmesian belief that there must be an answer, that you have to be able to know. She says, she goes on with this passage, she says, but that seems so loose. And here's Nick's answer. When the murders are committed by mathematicians, I said, you can solve them by mathematics. Most of them aren't this one. Most of them aren't, and this one wasn't. I don't want to go against your idea of what's right and wrong, but when I say he probably dissected the body so he could carry it to town in bags, I'm only saying what seems most probable. So he goes on and he keeps on breaking down the concept that we have had built up, and that's obviously a subtext for Nora, which is there is an answer, the truth can be known. Now moving ahead it's in my book, it's the second to, it's like the third from the last page. At one point, Nora says probably, and Nick's response is, it's a word you've got to use a lot in this business. One more quote that I wanted to bring to your attention because I like it so much. It's just at the end, and Nora says, Nick says, murder doesn't round out anybody's life except the murdered and sometimes the murderers. That may be, Nora said, but it's all pretty unsatisfactory. And I think if you wanted to kind of put a subtitle on where we've arrived in terms of the detective's place in the universe, that's it, where it's all pretty unsatisfactory. That idea that murder doesn't round out anybody's life except the murdereds and the murderers. In other words, that there is no full circle. There isn't a symmetry. There isn't always a reason why somebody does something, or that the reasons may seem completely unrelated to anything else. And that human beings are motivated by greed and by passion, but that we may not always be able to find out which greed and which passion until it's too late. I think those are all important points. So I want to close out with this idea of the great unknown. That if we look at everything that Nick says, as I pointed out in the last lecture, just try going through the book and seeing how many times Nick says, "I don't know," "maybe," and "probably," because those words stand in a very stark contrast to Holmes's, "I am certain of it, I can prove it, I am sure." And I think that as we proceed on, we're going to find that this theme plays itself out again and again. But also, believe it or not, we